Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome to the Xterra podcast. I'm Tom Patton. Multiple companies are either actively or working towards recovery of rocket boosters on barges in the ocean. SpaceX, of course, pioneered the technique, and both Blue Origin and Rocket Lab are developing similar maritime landing platforms. But a new company based in Tampa, Florida, hopes to be able to launch orbital-class rockets from a floating platform. Seagate Space recently introduced itself into the Space 2.0 landscape. And my guest on this edition of the Xterra podcast is Michael Anderson, co-founder and CEO of the company. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tom. Excited to be here. Excited to have this conversation.
I am too. I'm really looking forward to this because it's really something that's a little bit on the different side. But let's start out here. You and your co-founders came out of the marine logistics industry. What led you into the space arena?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Sean is my co-founder and our COO, and we have very different backgrounds and I would say different experiences and tenures in the maritime space. Sean started his career as a mariner. He was in the maritime space at our previous employer for almost 25 years. My background's a little bit different. I actually spent a couple of years in maritime, and prior to that was a consultant across a number of different transportation sectors, really more of a generalist focus on strategy, innovation, and finance. So that's kind of our pairing, our team. Sean's got the tenure. I've got the, I would say, breadth of experience. And I think that serves us well in a venture where we're really trying to bring two different sectors together.
So where did this idea come from then? Let's float a rocket out into the middle of the ocean and launch it into orbit. I mean, there have been, and we'll talk about some of the other things that had tried to be done offshore here in Jacksonville a little bit later on the program. But where did that idea originate?
Yeah. Well, it's been done before, right? So there is a precedent for launching rockets at sea that I'm sure we can get into talking about. For us, my job at my previous employer was really thinking about, in addition to other duties, thinking about new growth opportunities in the maritime space. And so we were looking at an array of different areas. Space was one of them. Space was an area where we see what SpaceX is doing with their fleet of recovery vessels. We see what Blue Origin is doing, as you already mentioned, kind of playing out that SpaceX playbook a little bit, at least so it seems. And we started thinking, how could there be a business opportunity in maritime in this area with this emerging adjacency? And really, it was initially about recovery. How could we provide recovery services to the next generation of rocket companies? And we started sitting down with folks in the industry as part of our discovery effort. And always on the back burner, there was this thought of, well, recovery's been done. There's opportunity there, but what about launch? And ultimately, we started looking at launch and the constraints in some of our land-based launch sites as really the opportunity we should be thinking about. And we were cognizant and aware that it's not an opportunity that's going to fit the risk profile of incumbents and legacy companies in the industry. And so that's when Sean and I started really thinking about looking at this as a new venture. And that's where Seagate Space was born, to be honest with you. So we just kind of started seeing this signal and ultimately said, this is something that we think there's an opportunity to go after ourselves.
Walk me through some of that maritime launch history, because I'm not particularly aware of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, Sea Launch has launched about 35 times at sea, I believe. That was mid to late 90s, and then early 2000s was really when they were an active venture. And there, we could talk more about the difference between us and our model and the Sea Launch model. But they've really, I think, inspired, this generation of offshore launch in a significant way. So our senior aerospace advisor, Jim Macer, was their president and GM. He oversaw about half of their launches. He came to his role after leading, they had an early failure, and he led the investigation into that failure. And they said, well, Jim, we want you to lead the next set of launches as well. So we have that background and knowledge in the tent with us, so to speak. Our model is very different from Sea Launch. We're not building our own rocket. We're not an end-to-end launch provider.
Right.
But we do have, I would say, in our DNA, some of the aspects of Sea Launch system, but in a scaled down profile. So that's what we think fits this modern cohort of rocket companies, and we're excited to continue that legacy of Sea Launch. More recently, we've seen there's a spaceport in China that has brought on Sea Launch as a capability
Hmm.
and has launched a number of times successfully. Again, a very different model than what we plan to pursue. They're using legacy maritime assets that they've retrofitted for launch purposes. We're thinking about something that's a little bit more novel and outside of the box. But yeah, there's not a long history of Sea Launch, but there
Right.
definitely is to some extent.
Take me through some of the technology on this, because as I'm sitting
Yeah.
here thinking about, particularly on the recovery side of it, those platforms have to be purpose built for a specific spacecraft. You're not going to, very likely not going to land a Blue Origin booster on a SpaceX barge. So
Mhm.
how do you have technology that will allow you to work with multiple customers and adapt it so that all of those rockets will be able to launch from your platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I don't want to indicate that we can, have a pure one size fits all, right? I think
Sure.
there'll be some edge cases. But what we're designing is a platform that can be constructed modularly and gives us I would say, easier way to adjust the design to accommodate more than one user. And so a typical barge or a vessel asset is going to be fixed form. There's a steel hull component, and it's very hard to change the dimensions of that asset. It's hard to even go and change it on the drawing board, right? What we've
Hmm.
designed is something where I don't want to give too much away here, but there's incremental units to allow the asset to be constructed piecemeal, and that allows us to change the form factor. It allows us to add attributes where they're needed versus not. And it's really unique in maritime, but I think what this industry needs is a unique solution of that ilk, because as you said, there's such a different array of companies that are all doing different things, all have different rocket systems, all have different launch systems. And so what we believe they need is a maritime asset profile that can be conducive to that and that can be scaled up, scaled down in various ways. And that's what we're pursuing.
So how does that platform then reduce costs compared to existing land-based infrastructure?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. And I think the reality is that right now, the land-based infrastructure that's being utilized is not being utilized at a market rate, right? A lot of it is legacy facilities that are now being, leased or somehow attributed to some of these commercial launch companies in a way that is subsidized, right? It's subsidized
Hmm.
because it's existing infrastructure that's kind of up for grabs and available, and there's no market rate. I think there's certainly some instances where we're seeing greenfield builds, and those are very expensive. I believe
Right.
SpaceX, their Starbase, I think that they're just leasing the land for about 16 million a year is what
Mm.
I've seen.
Yeah.
And so that's an expensive, just the land acquisition element is very expensive. We can print real estate offshore using our platform system, print, and kind of using that as a tongue-in-cheek way to say it. But what we're doing is creating space offshore where you can launch rockets at sea, and you don't need the large land acquisition that's required to build a shoreside site. The reality is that as these existing facilities start to get gobbled up and become more and more utilized, now the differential is going to be more clear, where you've got, can I build a new facility, which requires me to go and find a greenfield site and basically start from square A, including land acquisition costs, or can I launch at sea using a platform like ours, which foregoes all of that relatively expensive underlying cost that isn't on the books today.
What kind of metrics define success for you for your first demonstration mission, which you've now got planned for next year?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we believe we can go after a full scale launch, all things notwithstanding, 12 months is our timeline for that. I think you
Hmm.
probably got that message from Sean. And I think for us, the goal is to find a partner who wants to participate in that alongside us. We can then customize our first iteration of the asset for that user. Um, and we think with our modular design, we can construct at a faster pace than something that needs to be built in the shipyard, and ultimately needs to go through a lot of the traditional maritime asset milestones. But we're also, I think, pursuing a scaled down demo version, which I'm pretty excited about there, which we could put out there quite a bit faster.
Hmm.
And we are looking at partners for that maybe aren't commercial partners, but we're looking at potentially university clubs and um, users of smaller rockets, sounding rockets, research rockets, where we could launch off of a smaller, not a full scale asset. And we're looking at maybe even doing that in the summertime if all things come as we hope. So there's, I think, for me, the key metric here, and it's a lot different than some of the traditional maritime players would view or consider it. The key metric here for me is speed. How quickly can we prove the viability of this concept? How quickly can we show that launch at sea is a true alternative? Because I think once we show that, we'll be able to really move the industry in that direction. Versus when I go out to these industry events, what I typically hear is, well, we just need a couple more $1 billion and we can build another facility somewhere, not quite sure where that would be. And the reality is, once we show that our system is viable and that this is a real opportunity for folks in the industry to increase their launch cadence, then I think we get a snowball effect. And so speed to that first proof of concept is the key metric for me.
You mentioned Sea Launch and the fact that you've got one of their former executives on your board. How much of Sea Launch DNA is in your company?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Sea Launch to some extent was ahead of its time. When Sea Launch was operational, you didn't have the rocket reusability. You didn't
Hmm.
have a lot of the technology that our future customers are deploying today. But they had the right idea on the maritime side. They just had to accommodate for a much larger, kind of more cumbersome rocket system. But what Sea Launch was able to achieve was an asset that was able to be positioned very rapidly, right? So move out to the launch site at a rapid rate, relatively efficient for its size, was able to get very stable and hold station very effectively.
Hmm.
And so those attributes are what we're designing for in our system. And I think Sea Launch's semi-submersible form factor was a strong one, and one that we're considering heavily. So I think Sea Launch had the right idea in the development of their maritime asset. I don't know if that's their DNA in our company. Jim is on our advisory board.
Hmm.
Um, we don't have anyone else from Sea Launch today directly involved. We're definitely inspired by, but I think what we're doing is new altogether.
Who then are your target customers, Michael? Who are you
Yeah,
targeting?
great question. Yeah, for launch, I think we're
Uh-huh.
we're targeting our system is being designed for the 40 to 80 foot rockets. So there's
Okay.
a handful of players that are developing those SLV systems. You've got Rocket Lab, you've got Firefly, you've got Phantom, Via, you've got ABL or now Longwall. Astra's in there. There's a handful of others where it's not clear if they're going to deploy their SLV system or if they're going to kind of move right ahead to some of the larger rocket systems. But yeah, there's 5 to 10 groups in there that are developing these smaller rockets for a precision payload to orbit. And I think that's our starting point, right? That's the cohort that our asset can accommodate. That's the cohort, quite honestly, that we see getting squeezed out of some of the existing facilities. So there's an incentive there for them to look at and experiment with solutions like these. So that's where we're starting. Not to say that we are not in the future interested in what does it look like to launch a larger rocket at sea?
Sure.
We certainly are, but I think certainly there's a need to prove what we're doing here, and I think the smaller scale is the right starting point for us for a variety of factors.
It'd take quite a barge to get an SLS out
Yeah,
into the ocean for launch.
yeah, that's, I don't know if a barge is the right solution there. We have some ideas for sure, and I know. Look, we know that SpaceX has looked at launch at sea in the past, right? They've
Right.
gone and actually acquired oil rigs. Um, so the industry's thinking about it, and so SpaceX and I'm sure Blue Origin as well are all considering their options. But for us, as a new venture, what we want to do is start in an area where there's a relatively a manageable size factor, and then scale up and look at how we can support the larger rockets in the future as the industry evolves.
My guest is Michael Anderson, co-founder and CEO of Seagate Space on the Xterra podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Xterra, the Journal of Space Commerce. And please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Whether you're a space professional or enthusiast, paid subscribers have first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the new space economy. Just visit www.xterrajsc.com and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce independent as we chronicle, cajole, and when necessary, critique the commercial space industry. Michael, how do you balance cost effectiveness with safety and efficiency demands?
Yeah, that's a great question, an important one. I mean, safety culture in maritime is paramount, right? And so coming from, there's a lot of things that I think we'll need to shift away from,
Hmm.
candidly, with regards to the norms of the legacy maritime industry. But safety culture is not on that list. And certainly what happens in aerospace is risky relative to moving, container units of cargo from A to B. But I think that the standards of how you operate and how you put safety, paramount and first and foremost, those are certainly not things that need to be sacrificed. And honestly, I don't believe lead to operational efficiencies in the long run. So I think it's kind of a false trade-off or false, there's not a sacrifice between efficiency and safety in the long run. They're one and the same in large part. At least that's how I view it. And so what we're doing is designing an asset that is highly efficient because it's purpose built for launch and potentially recovery as well, right? That's not a trade-off
Hmm.
in safety. That's just a customization of key design aspects that allow us to serve this customer base more effectively. But from a safety perspective, there's no trade-offs in what we're doing.
Kind of along those lines, I'm sure you're aware that in the 1970s, the NRC proposed floating nuclear power plants,
Yeah.
and Westinghouse actually started construction on manufacturing a plant here in Jacksonville. Obviously, that idea never took off, but it does beg the question of environmental concerns for anything offshore. How do you address those environmental impact concerns both during and after launch?
Yeah, great question. And it's interesting that you brought up the nuclear element. That's an interesting, kind of interesting example. I mean, look, offshore oil and gas exploration has, its own set of environmental challenges
Sure.
and negative impacts where there's been failures. I think for me, with what we're doing, we're moving effectively a industrial operation from a relatively fragile coastal environment, right? That's where the majority of our launch sites sit
Hmm.
today, to an area where there's a lot less community conflicts and a lot less substantial environmental conflicts. But that doesn't excuse us or our future launch customers from, being good stewards of that environment as well. I think that um, we're able to do offshore activities from a launch perspective in a way that's not going to impact the environment, as long as we're responsible and as long as we maintain some of the standards that we have in our current way of launching. And I think, quite honestly, I don't know that the comparison to nuclear is a totally fair one, because I think actually there's reasons why nuclear plants are built on the shore at sea, for cooling and access to some key attributes that make their operations more effective. But having nuclear plants near the water is actually an increased risk factor. I don't think that's the case for launch. I think actually we're getting advantages and benefits from moving launch offshore.
So then what kinds of lessons have you maybe learned from other past offshore projects like the Makani Wind project at
Yeah.
Google X? How do those lessons apply to what it is that you're trying to do?
Great question. Yeah, and so our chief technology officer, our lead design, he was one of the leaders on that project.
Hmm.
And I think for me, and it's Makani, it's also just offshore wind in general. If you look at where the offshore wind industry is, or if you
Right.
look at why the offshore oil and gas industry was able to matriculate in a maybe advantaged way. I think there needs to be a reason to go offshore. There needs to be a business case. There needs to be some advantages operationally. Just going offshore for the sake of going offshore, it does not a successful venture make. And so for us, again, that's why we're designing custom purpose-built assets that provide those advantages as opposed to just providing an alternative to something that's already working to some extent.
One of the major issues I think with the wind generators offshore has been the undersea subsonic vibrations that have given a
Mm.
lot of problem to marine life. Do you have anything that might kind of translate into uh, that situation with what it is that you're doing, or is it just because you go out there, you put a barge, it keeps stationed for a little while, rocket launches, that makes a lot of noise, but then it goes away?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think noise and really, um, all attributes of potential disruption to marine life, it's going to be very temporary as opposed to with other industries offshore where it's a constant point of interaction. That said, I think there's learnings we can take from those industries. I do know that offshore wind and others have looked at, okay, how can we make sure that certain marine life is well cleared in advance of any sort of drilling operation or installation operation. I think we can take those technologies as well to make sure that we're not coming into. I think the risk of direct conflicts is much lower just because of the operational cadence here. But I think we can take those technologies and find a way to make sure that we're being good stewards of the ocean.
What about the risk of launch anomalies? If you lose one, rocket goes in the ocean. Um, Obviously, that happens now. So
Right.
I don't know if that's going to be a huge, major concern for you, but it might happen a lot closer to the actual uh, lighting of the rocket. So, what is kind of your contingency plan for those things?
Yeah. No, that's an interesting. Yeah, I mean, so we've for a long time recovered rockets in the ocean in various ways, right?
Hmm.
And or just splash them down and that's their resting place.
Either whole or
Um,
not, but
exactly, exactly, exactly. So this kind of idea of recovering rockets whole is a new concept altogether with SpaceX and their booster recovery. So I think it's a good point. I don't know that there is necessarily, we're talking about moving 20 miles offshore perhaps versus a coastal launch. I don't know that there's an increased risk of seeing, rockets splash down in a way that's more detrimental to the environment than if you're launching from the coast.
Mhm.
I think for us, what we're looking at doing is really building the platform, and so the extent to which the rocket needs to be designed, changed, retrofitted in a way that is conducive to offshore launch. That's something we really want to partner with the rocket and the launch providers on, as opposed to taking on ourselves. We're the Maritime group that's focused
Right.
on serving that customer base. But certainly there's interplay, and certainly these are questions that we'll be considering in our design and operational development efforts alongside the group that ultimately will be responsible for kind of answering them and making sure that their rockets aren't falling into the ocean in a detrimental way.
Then how critical are those partnerships to being able to scale your platform and even get adoption of your platform?
Very critical. And I mean, we rattle off some of the names of the potential future customers. We've had exploratory conversations and are working on formalizing the partnership with several of them. But the extent to which our asset, it's not existing steel sitting around waiting for a user, right? Our
Right.
asset is going to be informed by the needs of these companies and the partnerships that we'll develop with them. So yeah, we're really looking to be in the tent and having a good interplay between the industry and our position as the maritime service provider for this industry. So it's critical, and we've definitely gotten good feedback and good input. I can tell you that
Hmm.
many of these groups have looked at this to some extent in the past. They've looked at it in a way that ultimately didn't move forward, obviously, and I think telling you, the reason for that is because they haven't had a group that wants to find a way to innovate and adjust for their needs. And so that's exactly what we're looking to do. And I think it's just continuing to bring that message to the industry and finding the groups that want to partner with us and lean in as well.
Which leads to kind of an interesting question about the business case, because obviously, as you talked about before, for a land-based launch, they either have to lease a facility or build their own facility. Um, so are you kind of going to want to become, for lack of a better term, the rent-a-car of launch facilities?
Rent a car. I don't know if that's the group that I would compare us to. Um, I think that yeah, that we want to become the asset and service provider
Hmm.
for the launch industry when we're talking about infrastructure. And the rent a car model is probably maybe a known commodity, but I think that there's companies that do this in oil and gas, third-party providers to oil and gas majors that help develop their drilling facilities, manage their drilling facilities, operate their drilling facilities. That's probably the cohort that I would compare us to from an industrial perspective.
That's what happens when I ask a question off the top of my head.
Yeah, I rent a car. I mean, who doesn't? Yeah, I think it's a good thought. There's probably a few better examples that are more aligned to industry.
I'll work on that for the next time we talk.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds
Just a
good.
couple of things more, Michael. What are some of the key technology challenges you're innovating around, like propulsion
Yeah,
systems and integration?
yeah, definitely. I mean, and we learn a lot from Jim and Sea Launch in this regard around
Right.
their challenges. So, and again, it goes back to the list that I gave you around what we're designing for.
Hmm.
The corollary there is the challenge that we're trying to solve. And there's really no operational cadence similar to what we're doing here, which is a platform that has to go out into the middle of the ocean quickly in a fuel efficient manner, kind of on demand almost, just given some of the needs of the launch industry. And then once it's there, get really stable and get
Hmm.
really stationary. And so those are the challenges we're trying to solve. Sea Launch solved them using technology from 25 years ago, and maritime technology has advanced quite a bit. So there's, I think, existing technologies now that we need to integrate in a way that solves for those pain points and needs that I just described. Stability is one that's going to be very, very interesting. Certainly, there's a lot of stability technology. Cruise lines have really led here as well, as far as
Hmm.
installation of stability technology from a maritime perspective. And we believe that we can stabilize the platform substantially using that technology, as well as just like the form factors of our design. But there's a really high requirement when it comes to launch from a stability perspective. And it's not something you have to
Right.
worry about. The ground is not shifting underneath you when you're launching from land. So that I would say is a key challenge that going back to those partnerships that we're going to need to bring in. It's not just going to be solved from a maritime perspective. It's something that we're going to need to, kind of spin on together.
How does Seagate's long-term vision align with the global space industry's 2030 goals?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in my mind, as far as achieving some of the volume goals that I see in the industry and getting not just mass to orbit, but mass to orbit in a way that allows for certain interesting technologies to flourish. I think that we are very well aligned in that all of the amazing development and innovation from a vehicle perspective, a lot of it's happening across the board, but a lot of the really, I would say, like interesting and unique elements are coming from the cohort of companies that we consider customers. And for them to get to space, I do believe that there needs to be additional infrastructure put in place. It's not something that cohort necessarily needs to take on, or I don't think it's optimal for them to try to take that on individually. So I think having a service provider that's looking to open the aperture for that group will certainly help get us to those 2030 goals in a way that isn't isn't just a couple of players being successful and kind of normalizing the industry before it's ready to be normalized.
SpaceX is looking to really increase its launch cadence from the Cape. I know they just asked the FAA for an addition to go up to like 120 launches a year. Is that part of your business model as well? Because there is so much more demand for launch at this point that there needs to be more places from which companies can launch?
Oh, definitely. Yes, exactly. I mean, there's some innate benefits to launch at sea. There's trade-offs as well. We've discussed some of those and how we'll mitigate them. But the overall driver for us is the existing infrastructure is at capacity, is soon to be over capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the positioning of a lot of the existing launch pads, you're not able to have launches going from all of them at a given point in time. Some of the pads are in proximity to each other where a launch is occurring, you're not even able to work or operate your pad
Sure.
or test or prepare or construct. So there's this emerging constraint, and our overall premise is that the future of launch infrastructure isn't going to be exactly what we've built in the past, and that there's a place in that future for maritime and maritime launch.
One thing more, and we ask this kind of as our exit question of all of our guests, and that's to look ahead 10 or 15 years in the world of space commerce and
Sure.
consider the role of Seagate Space in that, and tell me what you're seeing.
Yeah, no, it's a great and exciting question. We're focused very much on this asset, this platform, what we're designing, why it's a better option for this specific cohort. But ultimately, what we're envisioning is an offshore launch system, a system where we can launch at sea, we can recover at sea. Perhaps there's even a sea-based hub where, to some extent, we can retrofit, reload, and maximize the reusability of rockets all at sea. So I think 10, 15 years from now, there's an opportunity for us to have a viable end-to-end launch infrastructure offshore. And not to say that it'll fully replace the shore-based infrastructure, but in our vision, we are getting to parity with it, and it's something that's commonplace as opposed to a novelty.
Michael, thank you so much. It's been an interesting conversation, and I wish you the best of luck. We'll keep our eyes on you since I'm kind of right around the corner from your folks here in
Yeah,
Jacksonville. We'll definitely be in touch.
awesome. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate this opportunity, and it was great talking to you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Xterra podcast. Check out our YouTube channel and be sure to click on subscribe so you can stay up to date on developments in space commerce and be notified when we post new videos. You can get daily updates on space commerce by subscribing to the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack at www.xterrajsc.com. And please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Whether you're a space professional or enthusiast, paid subscribers have first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the new space economy. Just visit xterrajsc.com and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce independent as we chronicle, cajole, and when necessary, critique the commercial space industry. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at xterrajsc. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for listening.